The morning of March 3rd, 1943, Port Moresby, New Guinea. Major Ed Larner stood beside his modified B-25 Mitchell, watching his ground crew load the last 500-pound bomb into the aircraft's bay. Around him, 11 other B-25 seconds from the 90th Bomb Squadron sat on the hardstand, their engines ticking in the tropical heat. Each aircraft carried a modification that had never been tested in actual combat against ships, a modification that some senior officers had called suicidal, and that most pilots privately believed would get them all killed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 4 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns protruded from the nose where the bombardier's station used to be. 4 more were mounted in blisters on the fuselage sides. Combined with the dorsal turret, each aircraft could bring 14 50 caliber machine guns to bear on a single point. The firepower was unprecedented, devastating in theory. But theory and combat were different animals entirely, and today they would learn which one survived. Larner had spent the last 2 months training his squadron on a radical new attack method called skip bombing. The concept was deceptively simple. Fly your bomber at wave-top height, 50 feet or less above the water, straight at an enemy ship. Release your bomb from point-blank range, maybe 200 yards out. The bomb's forward momentum would cause it to skip across the water's surface like a stone thrown across a pond, then slam into the ship's hull at or below the waterline where armor was thinnest. The skip bombing technique violated every doctrine in the Army Air Force manual. Medium bombers were designed to drop their ordnance from 5,000 to 10,000 feet, safely above anti-aircraft fire. What Larner and his men were about to attempt meant flying directly into that fire, exposing themselves to every machine gun and cannon the Japanese could bring to bear, with zero margin for error. One moment of hesitation, one slight miscalculation of altitude or distance, and you'd either fly straight into the ocean or plow directly into the side of an enemy destroyer at 250 miles per hour. The target was already spotted. A Japanese convoy, 16 ships strong, 8 destroyers escorting 8 transport vessels, packed with nearly 7,000 troops, desperately needed to reinforce the garrison at Lae. Allied codebreakers had intercepted and decrypted the Japanese plans days earlier. 5th Air Force Commander Lieutenant General George Kenney had assembled every available aircraft in the theatre for this one engagement. If the convoy reached Lae, those 7,000 fresh troops could tip the entire New Guinea campaign back toward Japanese control. If the convoy was destroyed, Japan would lose its ability to reinforce by sea, potentially shortening the Pacific War by months or even years. Larner understood the mathematics with brutal clarity. The B-17 Flying Fortresses would attack first from medium altitude, disrupting the convoy's formation and forcing defensive responses. Australian Beaufighters would follow, strafing the anti-aircraft gun positions to suppress defensive fire. Then Larner's squadron would come in at masthead height, skipping bombs directly into the transport hulls while their 14 forward-firing guns shredded anything that moved on deck. The plan required split-second timing and absolute coordination between aircraft attacking from 3 different altitudes simultaneously. It required pilots to hold course through walls of tracer fire while flying so low that wingtip vortices left visible tracks in the ocean surface. Most critically, it required someone to go first, to make the initial run that would either prove the tactic worked or demonstrate in flames and wreckage that it didn't. That responsibility fell to Larner. As squadron commander, he would lead the first element directly into the teeth of Japanese defensive fire. His wingmen would watch his approach, his bomb release, his results. If he succeeded, they would follow. If he failed, they would know within seconds whether to abort or adapt. The concept of skip bombing had emerged from desperation more than inspiration. Throughout 1942, American bombers had achieved dismal results attacking Japanese shipping. High-altitude bombing against moving vessels produced hit rates well below 10%. Even when bombs struck home, the small 500 and 1,000-pound weapons often lacked sufficient penetration power to sink modern steel-hulled transports. The Japanese convoys that had successfully reinforced Guadalcanal and Buna demonstrated the inadequacy of existing American bombing doctrine against maritime targets. General Kenny had arrived in the Southwest Pacific area in August 1942 to find an air force equipped with obsolete aircraft, inadequate logistics, and tactics that weren't working. A former First World War pursuit pilot turned innovator, Kenny possessed the rare combination of tactical imagination and command authority necessary to implement radical changes. During his flight to Australia, Kenny and his aide Major William Benn had discussed alternative methods for attacking ships. En route, they tested the skip bombing concept, using a requisitioned Martin B-26 Marauder at Nandi in the Fiji Islands, discovering that bombs dropped from extreme low altitude did indeed skip across water like stones. Upon reaching the Southwest Pacific, Kenny immediately began implementing changes that would revolutionize the air war in the theater. He appointed unconventional thinkers to key positions. He scrapped aircraft that didn't perform and requisitioned types that European commanders considered undesirable. Most importantly, he encouraged innovation from below, creating an excellent environment where experienced combat pilots and maintenance personnel could experiment with new tactics and modifications without waiting for formal approval from Washington. Captain Paul "Pappy" Gunn became the embodiment of Kenny's innovation philosophy. A 43-year-old former Navy enlisted aviator who'd retired to run Philippine Airlines before the war, Gunn possessed mechanical genius combined with complete disregard for bureaucratic procedure. When Kenny met him in August 1942, Gunn was already converting A-20 Havoc light bombers into strafers by removing the bombardier compartment and installing 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns scavenged from wrecked fighters. Kenny immediately recognized Gunn's value and appointed him to his personal staff as Special Projects Officer with carte blanche to modify aircraft however necessary to make them more effective. Guns converted. A-20 strafers proved devastatingly successful in attacks against Japanese airfields, but the A-20 lacked the range necessary to reach targets throughout the theater. Kenny needed the same firepower in a longer-range platform. He needed the B-25. Mitchell converted from a medium-altitude level bomber into what he called a commerce destroyer, an aircraft optimized for low-altitude attacks against shipping. In late November 1942, Gunn began modifying B-25 seconds at Eagle Farms Field, near Brisbane. The conversion required removing the bombardier's compartment entirely, eliminating the Norden bomb site that had cost taxpayers thousands of dollars to develop, and installing 4 fixed 50-caliber Browning machine guns in the nose. Each gun was loaded with 500 rounds of ammunition. Additional guns were mounted in blisters on the fuselage sides. The modifications created severe engineering challenges. The concentrated forward firepower produced recoil forces that popped rivets and buckled thin aluminum panels. The removal of the bombardier and his equipment shifted the aircraft's center of gravity dangerously forward, requiring careful ballast adjustments and changes to takeoff procedures. Gunn solved these problems through trial and error, test-flying the prototypes himself, despite having no formal engineering training. By December 16, 1942, he'd completed enough conversions to equip a full squadron. Captain Ed Larner, recently transferred to command the 90th Bomb Squadron, received the first combat-ready strafers and immediately began developing tactics to employ them. Larner came from the generation of young American officers who'd learned their profession during peace but would define it in war. A graduate of flying school, he'd proven himself as both pilot and leader through months of combat operations in New Guinea. His squadron had suffered significant losses throughout 1942, including their previous commander, Captain William "Red" Johnson, killed in a transit accident on New Year's Eve. When Larner arrived to take command, the 90th Squadron was demoralized, exhausted, and skeptical about untested modifications that seemed designed to get them killed more efficiently. Larner understood that confidence came from competence, and competence came from training. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He spent January and February 1943 drilling his crews relentlessly on low-altitude attack procedures. The squadron practiced skip bombing runs against a wrecked British merchant ship that had run aground in Port Moresby harbour years before the war. The rusted hulk became their training target, absorbing hundreds of practice bombs as pilots learned the precise timing required to release ordnance at wavetop height. The training revealed both the potential and the danger of the skip bombing technique. When executed properly, bombs released at 50 feet altitude and 200 yards range would skip twice across the water surface before striking the target ship at or near the waterline. The horizontal impact angle meant bombs would penetrate the hull before their delayed action fuses detonated inside the vessel, maximizing damage. Hit rates during practice runs exceeded 70%, a dramatic improvement over high-altitude bombing's sub-10% accuracy. However, the training also demonstrated the technique's unforgiving nature. Pilots who released too early watched their bombs skip harmlessly past the target. Released too late and the bomb struck the water with insufficient forward velocity, sinking immediately or bouncing upward to explode in mid-air. Approach at too high an altitude and the bomb's impact angle changed, causing it to ricochet over the target or break apart on water impact. Fly too low and the aircraft's propellers would strike the ocean surface, instantly catastrophic at 250 miles per hour. The most dangerous aspect wasn't the bombing itself, but the approach. To reach the release point, pilots had to fly straight and level for a minimum of 30 seconds, maintaining exact altitude and heading while every Japanese gun on the target vessel fired directly at them. Unlike dive bombing, where the pilot approached from above at high speed and could maneuver during the attack, skip bombing required sustained exposure to defensive fire with no evasive action possible. The modified B-25 strafers partially offset this vulnerability through their forward-firing armament. As they approached the target, pilots could suppress defensive fire by hosing the enemy ship's deck with machine gun fire. 14 50 caliber guns firing simultaneously put roughly 200 pounds of lead per second into a target area. That volume of fire could shred exposed gun crews, disable light anti-aircraft mounts, and force surviving defenders to take cover rather than aim effectively. Still, Japanese destroyers carried 25mm anti-aircraft cannons and multiple machine gun positions. Their fire control systems, while not as sophisticated as American equivalents, were adequate for engaging low-altitude targets. A B-25, flying straight toward a destroyer at 200 feet altitude, presented an easy shot for trained gunners. One direct hit from a 25mm explosive shell could destroy an engine, rupture fuel tanks, or kill the pilots. The modified strafers lacked armor protection beyond minimal plating around the cockpit. They were designed for maximum firepower, not survivability. By early March, intelligence reports indicated a major Japanese convoy was forming at Rabaul. Allied codebreakers working at Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne and in Washington had been reading Japanese naval communications for months, systematically penetrating the encryption systems that Tokyo believed were unbreakable. The decrypted messages revealed that Imperial Japanese Army forces intended to transport approximately 7,000 troops from Rabaul to Leh aboard 8 transport vessels, escorted by 8 destroyers under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. The convoy would carry the second echelon of the 51st Division, along with artillery, ammunition, and aviation fuel desperately needed to maintain Japanese offensive operations in New Guinea. If these reinforcements arrived, they would enable renewed attacks against Allied positions and potentially reverse recent American and Australian gains. If the convoy was destroyed, Japan would lose not just the troops and supplies but also the psychological confidence to attempt further major sea lift operations in the theatre. General Kenny understood this was the opportunity he'd been preparing for since August. He assembled every operational bomber in 5th Air Force, along with all available Royal Australian Air Force squadrons. The attack plan called for coordinated strikes from multiple altitudes using different aircraft types, each optimized for specific roles. B-17, flying fortresses from the 43rd Bombardment Group, would attack first, from 7,000 feet altitude, using conventional level bombing to disrupt the convoy's formation and force the escorting destroyers to maneuver. B-25 Mitchells from the 38th Bombardment Group would follow from medium altitude, approximately 3,000 feet, continuing the pattern of sustained pressure. Australian Beaufighters from 30 Squadron would then sweep in at deck height immediately ahead of Larner's strafers, suppressing anti-aircraft positions with cannon and machine gun fire. The Beaufighters were heavily armed twin-engine fighters mounting 4 20mm cannons and 6 30-caliber machine guns in the nose. Flying at wave-top height, they would rake the enemy ship's decks, killing gun crews and destroying fire control equipment in the critical seconds before the skip-bombing B-25 seconds arrived. Finally, Larner's 12 modified B-25 seconds from the 90th Squadron would make their masthead runs, skipping bombs into the transport hulls, while their forward-firing guns massacred anything moving on deck. A 20 Havocs from the 89th Squadron, also equipped for skip bombing, would follow immediately behind to finish damaged vessels. P-38 Lightning fighters from the 35th and 49th Fighter Groups would provide high cover, engaging the approximately 100 Japanese Zero fighters expected to escort the convoy. The plan was sound in theory, but unprecedented in execution. No one had attempted coordinated attacks from multiple altitudes against a heavily defended convoy. The timing requirements were extraordinary. Each wave had to arrive at precisely the right moment to maintain continuous pressure without interfering with other attackers. Communication between formations would be minimal, relying mainly on visual signals. If coordination failed, aircraft from different squadrons could collide, bombs could hit friendly planes, or gaps in the attack sequence could allow Japanese defenders to reset their positions. The convoy departed Rabaul on the night of February 28th. Initially hidden by tropical storms that lashed the Bismarck and Solomon Seas, the ships remained undetected until March 1st, when a patrolling B-24 Liberator spotted them through a break in the clouds. High-altitude B-17 attacks that afternoon sank one transport and damaged others, but failed to stop the convoy's progress. Through the night, Australian Catalina flying boats shadowed the Japanese ships, maintaining contact despite atrocious weather conditions. By dawn on March 3rd, the convoy was approaching Lae, less than a day from its destination. The storms had cleared, leaving perfect attack weather. This would be the decisive moment. Either the coordinated Allied strike would devastate the convoy, or the Japanese reinforcements would reach Lae, and the entire campaign would shift. Larner received the final attack order at 8:55 in the morning. The rendezvous point was Cape Ward Hunt on New Guinea's north coast. All attacking formations would assemble there at 9:30 and proceed together to the target. He shouted to his squadron, "Cape Ward Hunt, 0930, let's go." The engines of 12 B-25 Strafers roared to life almost simultaneously. Ground crews pulled wheel chocks and scrambled clear as the aircraft began taxiing. Larner led the formation to the runway, advanced throttles to full power, and felt his heavily loaded bomber accelerate down the pierced steel planking that served as Port Moresby's main runway. The nose wheel stayed planted until 120 miles per hour, far faster than the normal rotation speed, a necessary precaution because guns' modifications had shifted the center of gravity dangerously forward. At 120, Larner eased back on the yoke, and the B-25 lifted reluctantly into the humid morning air. The flight to Cape Ward Hunt took approximately 30 minutes. As Larner's formation climbed to attack altitude, which for skip bombers meant staying below 500 feet, he could see other elements of the strike force converging. B-17 seconds circled at 7,000 feet, their silver aluminum skin flashing in the tropical sun. Medium-altitude B-25 seconds from the 38th held position at 3,000. Somewhere below him, Australian Beaufighters hugged the wave tops. Above everyone, P-38 Lightning fighters wove protective patterns, their distinctive twin-boom silhouettes unmistakable against the blue sky. At precisely 9:30, the entire formation turned toward the Japanese convoy's last known position, approximately 50 miles southeast of Finschhafen. The attack would begin in 30 minutes. Larner ran through his mental checklist one final time. Bomb fuses set for delayed detonation, roughly 45 seconds. Forward guns loaded and charged. Dorsal turret ready. Bombardier removed from the aircraft, his station now filled with 450 caliber Brownings operated by the pilot. This was the fundamental change that made skip bombing possible. In conventional level bombing, the bombardier controlled bomb release, using the Norden sight to calculate the precise moment when ballistic trajectory would intersect the target. In skip bombing, the pilot controlled everything. The pilot aimed the entire aircraft at the target like a fighter plane, used the fixed forward guns for reference, and judged bomb release point through experience and instinct rather than mathematical calculation. At 10:05, the lead B-17 seconds reached the convoy and began their attack runs. From 5 miles away and 3,000 feet below, Larner watched the heavy bombers drop their ordnance. 1,000-pound bombs fell away from the B-17 seconds bomb bays, tumbling toward the ocean far below. The Japanese ships immediately began evasive maneuvers, destroyers laying smoke screens while transports executed emergency turns. Anti-aircraft fire erupted across the convoy, black puffs of exploding shells marking the sky around the attacking fortresses. The medium-altitude B-25 seconds followed minutes later, adding to the chaos. Now the Japanese defenders had to divide their attention between high and medium-altitude threats. Smoke from the screen generators drifted across the convoy, reducing visibility. Several vessels showed damage from the initial attacks, trailing smoke or listing noticeably. One transport appeared dead in the water, its engine spaces clearly hit. Then came the bow fighters, 13 aircraft screaming across the ocean surface at 300 miles per hour. The Japanese ships, accustomed to high and medium altitude attacks, had positioned their defences to engage aircraft above them. The sudden appearance of the Australian fighters at wave-top height caught them unprepared. 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns per aircraft poured devastating fire into the destroyer escorts. Gun crews were scythed down where they stood. Light anti-aircraft mounts exploded into fragments. Fire control stations disintegrated under the cannon shells. The bowfighters' attack lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds transformed the tactical situation. Now it was Larner's turn. He pushed his throttles forward and dropped to 50 feet above the ocean, his wingmen tight on either side in a 3-ship V formation. Behind him, the rest of the squadron spread into elements of 3, each pilot selecting his own target from the convoy spread across miles of ocean ahead. The reality of wave-top flight at 250 miles per hour exceeded anything training had prepared them for. The ocean surface blurred beneath the aircraft's belly. Spray from wave crests peppered the windscreen. The slightest control input produced immediate response, the heavily laden bomber wallowing in ground effect between lift and the ocean's killing embrace. Ahead, a large transport filled Larner's windscreen. He could see the vessel's details with unnatural clarity. Troops crowded the decks in ill-fitting life, preservers. Anti-aircraft positions swiveled toward his approaching aircraft. Tracer fire began reaching toward him, bright orange lines connecting the ship to his propeller arc. 200 yards. Larner pressed the firing button for his forward guns. 14 50 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The recoil shuddered through the aircraft's structure. On the transport's deck, the effect was apocalyptic. Heavy machine gun rounds shredded everything they touched. Metal, wood, and human tissue disintegrated identically under the onslaught. 100 yards. Still firing. The transport's superstructure was being systematically demolished by the massed firepower. Larner could see individual rounds impacting, see pieces of the ship's structure flying away. 50 yards. Now. Larner hit the bomb release button. The aircraft lurched upward as 2 500-pound bombs dropped away from the bomb bay. He immediately began a climbing turn to the right, trusting his bombardier's delayed action fuses to give him the 45 seconds needed to escape the blast radius. Behind him, the bombs struck the water exactly as practiced. The first skipped once, twice, then slammed into the transport's hull 5 feet above the waterline. The second followed an almost identical path, impacting 10 feet farther aft. Both bombs punched through the steel plating and penetrated deep into the vessel's interior before their fuses functioned. Larner was a quarter-mile away when the bombs detonated. The explosions were muffled, contained within the ship's hull, but their effects were immediately visible. The transport shuddered, its entire structure flexing from the internal blasts. Smoke and steam erupted from hatches and portholes. The vessel began settling by the bow, clearly mortally wounded. Larner's wingmen had watched his run with absolute attention. When they saw his bombs hit, saw the transport begin to sink, saw their squadron commander climbing away alive, the last hesitation vanished. They broke formation and selected their own targets. Lieutenant Charles Howe went after another transport, screaming in at wave-top height with his forward guns hammering. He released 2 bombs at point-blank range. One scored a direct hit amidships. The other was a near miss that detonated in the water alongside the hull, the underwater explosion rupturing plates below the waterline. The transport immediately began listing, taking on water through the ripped hull plating. Across the convoy, the pattern repeated. Modified B-25 seconds dove on the transport vessels from every angle, their forward firepower suppressing defences while their skipped bombs slammed into hulls. The A-20 Havocs followed, adding their ordnance to targets already damaged. The Japanese destroyers attempted to intervene, laying smoke and engaging the attackers with every gun they could bring to bear, but they were overwhelmed by the coordinated assault from multiple directions and altitudes. Japanese Zero fighters dove through the American P-38 screen, attempting to reach the vulnerable bombers during their attack runs. Several B-25 seconds took damage from 20mm cannon fire. One strafer, hit in the port engine during its bombing run, struggled to maintain altitude. The pilot nursed the crippled bomber away from the convoy, gradually losing height. The crew managed to reach the New Guinea coast before crash landing in the jungle. Remarkably, all survived. The entire attack lasted approximately 20 minutes from the first B-17 bombs to the last A-20 egressing the target area. When the American and Australian aircraft finally cleared, leaving the convoy to its fate, the tactical situation was clear. Every transport vessel was either sinking, burning, or so severely damaged that reaching Lae was impossible. 3 destroyers were also hit, with one visibly settling in the water. The remaining destroyers attempted rescue operations, pulling survivors from the oil-slicked ocean, but thousands of Japanese soldiers went down with their transports or drowned in the Bismarck Sea. Larner led his surviving aircraft back to Port Moresby, carefully nursing the squadron home. As they crossed the Owen Stanley Mountains and began their descent toward base, he had time to process what they'd accomplished. The skip bombing tactic had worked beyond anyone's projections. Hit rates exceeded 70%. The concentrated forward firepower had suppressed defensive fire precisely as intended. Most critically, they'd proven that medium bombers could engage heavily defended surface vessels and survive. The cost had been remarkably light. 1 B-25, lost with crew, recovered. 2 others damaged but repairable. 4 P-38 fighters lost in aerial combat. No B-17 seconds or bow fighters were down. Against these losses, the Allies had destroyed an entire Japanese convoy, eliminating nearly 7,000 enemy troops who would never reinforce Lae. The strategic implications were immense. When Larner's wheels touched down at Port Moresby, ground crews were already celebrating. Word of the victory had reached base via radio reports from reconnaissance aircraft shadowing the convoy. Maintenance personnel swarmed the returned strafers, assessing damage and preparing them for the next mission. Intelligence officers began debriefing crews, documenting exactly what had worked and what needed improvement. General Kenny arrived at Port Moresby that evening, personally congratulating the crews who'd executed his battle plan so effectively. He made a point of seeking out Larner, shaking the major's hand, and acknowledging that the 90th Squadron commander had just validated a tactical innovation that would change the Pacific Air War. But Kenny also understood that one successful battle didn't constitute doctrine. The skip bombing technique needed to be refined, taught to other squadrons, and integrated into standard operating procedures. He immediately ordered Pappy Gunn to accelerate the B-25 modification program. Every Mitchell bomber in the theatre would be converted to strafer configuration as rapidly as possible. Additional squadrons would receive training in skip bombing tactics, using the 90th Squadron's hard-won experience as the foundation. The impact of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea resonated far beyond the immediate tactical victory. In Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters received reports of the disaster with growing alarm. An entire reinforcement convoy destroyed before reaching its destination. 7,000 troops lost, 8 transport vessels sunk, 4 destroyers eliminated. The losses represented not just material wastage but a fundamental challenge to Japan's ability to maintain its defensive perimeter in the Southwest Pacific. Japanese naval staff officers studying the battle reports identified several critical failures. The convoy had been detected early, allowing the Allies time to concentrate overwhelming air power. The escorts had proven inadequate against coordinated attacks from multiple directions and altitudes simultaneously. Most disturbingly, the American bombers had demonstrated a new attack method that conventional defensive measures couldn't counter effectively. The skip bombing technique negated Japan's primary advantage in surface engagements, their superior torpedo and gunnery capabilities. Traditional naval combat doctrine assumed threats would come from other surface vessels or from high-altitude bombers that ships could evade through maneuver. Skip bombers attacking at wave-top height couldn't be avoided through evasive turns. They simply flew too fast and attacked from too close range for conventional defensive responses to succeed. In response, Japanese planners made a fundamental strategic decision. No further attempts would be made to reinforce Leh by large convoy. All subsequent troop movements would utilize submarines, small, fast destroyer transports, or overland routes through New Guinea's brutal interior terrain. This decision effectively ceded sea control in the region to Allied forces, dramatically altering the campaign's trajectory. For the ground forces fighting in New Guinea, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea's implications were immediate and decisive. The Japanese 18th Army, responsible for defending Leh and adjacent positions, had counted on those 7,000 reinforcements to sustain offensive operations. Without them, Japanese commanders were forced into defensive postures, ceding initiative to Australian and American ground forces. The Australian 9th Division, advancing along the coast toward Leh, suddenly faced an enemy that couldn't be reinforced or adequately supplied. American forces pushing inland through the Huon Peninsula encountered Japanese units that were increasingly isolated and undersupplied. The entire New Guinea campaign, which might have dragged on for additional years, had Japan successfully reinforced Leh, instead accelerated toward Allied victory. Major Ed Larner didn't have long to savor his role in this strategic success. He continued flying combat missions throughout March and April 1943, leading his squadron in additional anti-shipping strikes and ground support operations. His aggressive flying style, characterized by extremely low-altitude approaches and bold tactical decisions, earned respect from his crews, but concern from some peer commanders who considered his methods unnecessarily risky. On April 30th, 1943, Larner was returning from a mission to Dobodura with a B-25, loaded with passengers, baggage, tools, and 2,000 pounds of unused bombs. As he approached the airfield, he executed his trademark maneuver, a diving approach followed by a sharp pull-up into a chandelle, a dramatic climbing turn designed to bleed off excess speed. He'd performed this maneuver countless times in lightly loaded aircraft, but today, with the heavy cargo load, the physics were different. When Larner pulled back on the yoke, the heavily laden B-25 didn't have sufficient speed to complete the maneuver. The aircraft stalled, fell into a flat spin, and crashed into the ground. The bomb load detonated on impact. There were no survivors. Ed Larner was 29 years old. He'd commanded the 90th Squadron for less than 6 months. In that brief period, he'd transformed a demoralized unit into the premier anti-shipping squadron in the Pacific Theater. He'd personally proven the skip-bombing concept in combat, leading the attack that destroyed the Bismarck Sea convoy. His aggressive leadership had inspired dozens of other pilots to attempt attacks they'd previously considered suicidal. His death resulted not from enemy action but from the same aggressive spirit that made him effective in combat. The 90th Squadron continued operations under new leadership, applying the tactics Larner had helped develop. Skip bombing became standard procedure throughout 5th Air Force and eventually spread to other theaters. By late 1943, American medium bombers were routinely conducting masthead attacks against Japanese shipping throughout the Southwest Pacific, achieving hit rates that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Paul Papygun continued his modifications work, eventually incorporating a 75mm cannon into some B-25 variants, along with additional machine guns. The modifications he'd pioneered in Brisbane workshops were eventually adopted by North American aviation and incorporated into factory production. Late-war B-25J models rolled off assembly lines with 18 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, the most heavily armed production aircraft of World War II. The broader implications of the skip bombing technique extended beyond the Pacific. When Allied forces invaded Normandy in June 1944, modified B-25 and A-20 provided devastating close air support, using skip bombing methods, against bridges, fortifications, and troop concentrations. The tactic proved as effective against land targets as it had been against ships, demonstrating the innovation's versatility. Modern military historians studying the Battle of the Bismarck Sea identify it as a pivotal moment in the development of tactical air power. The battle demonstrated that properly coordinated air attacks could destroy heavily defended surface vessels without requiring friendly naval forces to engage. This concept would evolve into the anti-shipping doctrine that dominated late World War II operations and continues influencing naval aviation tactics today. The skip bombing technique itself, while effective with World War II technology, became obsolete with the advent of precision-guided munitions and standoff weapons. Modern anti-ship missiles can engage targets from beyond visual range, eliminating the need for aircraft to make the kind of point-blank attacks that Larner and his crews executed. However, the underlying principle, using specialized weapons delivery methods to maximize effectiveness against specific target types, remains fundamental to military aviation. The cost-exchange ratio achieved in the Bismarck Sea battle validated General Kenny's innovation-focused approach to air warfare. 13 Allied aircraft and personnel lost against 8 transports, 4 destroyers, approximately 3,000 Japanese troops killed, and the strategic objective of denying reinforcement to Leh completely achieved. By any measure of military effectiveness, the battle represented a decisive Allied victory achieved through tactical innovation and aggressive execution. For the 7,000 Japanese soldiers who'd boarded those transports at Rabaul, the battle marked a terrible end. Most drowned when their ships sank, dragged under by heavy equipment or trapped below decks. Those who made it into the water faced Allied aircraft conducting follow-up attacks against survivors and rescue vessels, a brutal but militarily necessary action to prevent recovered troops from being returned to combat. Of the original 7,000, only approximately 1,200 eventually reached Leh, most without weapons or equipment. Another 2,700 were rescued and returned to Rabaul. The remaining 3,000 perished. This grim arithmetic of war, measuring success in destroyed vessels and eliminated enemy personnel, represented the Pacific conflict's fundamental nature. Both sides understood they were engaged in a war of annihilation where quarter was neither asked nor given. The strategic objectives, control of territory that would determine whether Japan or America dominated the Pacific basin, justified whatever tactics proved effective. Ed Larner understood this calculus when he led his squadron against the Bismarck Sea convoy. He wasn't attempting to achieve glory or personal distinction. He was executing a military mission that required someone to fly first into the teeth of enemy defenses, demonstrating either that the new tactic worked or that it didn't. His decision to make that first run personally, rather than ordering a subordinate to do so, reflected a particular kind of leadership that the military services prize above almost all others. Leading from the front, accepting personal risk before asking others to accept it, characterizes the kind of officer that soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines will follow into situations where survival is uncertain. Larner's crews watched him make that initial skip-bombing run against a Japanese transport. They saw him release his bombs, saw them hit, saw the target begin sinking, and saw their commander climb away alive. That visual demonstration was more effective than any briefing or training exercise could have been. It transformed skip bombing from a theoretical concept into a proven tactic that they could replicate. The 45 seconds between bomb release and detonation represented the most critical period of any skip bombing attack. Pilots had to clear the target area before their own weapons exploded, requiring immediate climbing turns and maximum power settings. During that climb-out, aircraft were vulnerable to defensive fire from other vessels in the convoy. Several B-25 seconds took damage during this phase, hit by guns from destroyers or adjacent transports. The delayed action fuses that made skip bombing effective also created this vulnerability window that conventional bombing didn't have. Larner's modification of standard procedure, advancing throttles to maximum power immediately upon bomb release and entering an aggressive climbing turn while still in range of enemy guns, reduced this vulnerability period but required exceptional flying skill. The heavily loaded B-25 seconds weren't particularly maneuverable at low altitude. Attempting tight turns at wave-top height courted the risk of stalling or striking the ocean with a wingtip. Yet Larner and his pilots executed these maneuvers repeatedly, trading safety margins for tactical effectiveness. The psychological impact on Japanese personnel aboard the targeted transports was devastating. Witnesses described the modified B-25 seconds as flying directly at their vessels, their forward guns creating visible lines of tracer fire that swept the decks like scythes. The troops, packed aboard transports with minimal cover, had no defense against this onslaught. The sound of 14 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously from a single aircraft was described by survivors as overwhelming, drowning out all other noise, including their own ship's defensive guns. When the skip bombs hit, penetrating the hulls below the waterline and detonating inside the vessels, the psychological effect compounded the physical damage. Troops trapped below decks had no way to reach the surface before their compartments flooded. Those on deck faced the choice between staying aboard a sinking ship or jumping into an ocean that was being actively strafed by circling aircraft. Either choice often proved fatal. The follow-up attacks on survivors, while militarily necessary to prevent the enemy troops from being recovered and returned to combat, troubled some Allied aircrews for the remainder of their lives. Strafing helpless men in the water violated deeply held notions about honorable combat. However, General Kenny and other senior commanders justified the action through cold strategic logic. Every Japanese soldier who reached Leh meant additional Allied casualties when ground forces had to dig them out of fortified positions. Preventing their recovery served the larger objective of minimizing friendly casualties. This moral complexity characterized the entire Pacific War. Both sides committed acts that would be considered war crimes under different circumstances. The Japanese had machine-gunned American aircrews parachuting from damaged B-17 seconds during the battle. Allied forces responded by strafing Japanese survivors. Neither action was justified under contemporary military law, yet both were understood within the context of a war where neither side expected or offered mercy. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea established patterns that would repeat throughout the remaining Pacific campaigns. American air power, properly concentrated and employing innovative tactics, could achieve decisive results against Japanese forces that retained tactical proficiency but lacked the industrial capacity to sustain losses. Each destroyed convoy, each sunk transport, each eliminated garrison represented resources that Japan couldn't replace, while America's industrial machine produced replacements faster than they could be expended. By mid-1943, this dynamic was becoming clear to Japanese strategic planners. The combined fleet's carrier aviation had been decimated at Midway. The merchant marine was being systematically destroyed by American submarines and aircraft. Ground forces throughout the Pacific were increasingly isolated as air and sea control shifted toward the Allies. Yet institutional momentum and cultural imperatives prevented Japan from seeking negotiated settlement. The war would continue until one side achieved complete military victory. For the pilots and crews of the 90th Bomb Squadron and other units that adopted skip bombing tactics, each mission represented a calculated risk. The tactic worked, achieving hit rates dramatically superior to conventional bombing, but it required flying into the concentrated defensive fire of enemy vessels with minimal margin for error. Some aircraft were lost. Some crews died. But the alternative, continuing high-altitude bombing that achieved minimal results while still exposing crews to risk, was strategically untenable. Ed Larner's legacy in Pacific air warfare extends beyond the specific battle where he proved skip bombing worked. He represented a generation of American officers who arrived in theater with conventional training but adapted rapidly to combat realities that contradicted peacetime doctrine. He recognized that the standard bombing methods taught at flying schools weren't working against maritime targets. He embraced Pappy Gunn's modifications despite skepticism from some peers. He trained his squadron relentlessly on a new technique that many considered suicidal, and when the critical moment arrived, he led from the front, making the first combat run personally rather than observing from a distance. This pattern of recognize, adapt, train, and lead from the front became the template for effective air combat leadership throughout World War II. Commanders who couldn't or wouldn't adapt to combat realities were replaced. Units that continued executing ineffective tactics suffered disproportionate casualties while achieving minimal results. The military services that prospered during the war were those that institutionalized rapid adaptation cycles, allowing successful innovations like skip bombing to spread quickly throughout the force. The technical evolution of American medium bombers, from 1942 through 1945, reflected this adaptive process. The early B-25B models that flew the Doolittle raid carried minimal forward-firing armament and were optimized for conventional level bombing. By war's end, B-25J models bristled with 18 forward-firing machine guns, carried heavier bomb loads, and were employed almost exclusively for low-altitude attack missions. The transformation occurred not through formal engineering studies but through field modifications developed by people like Pappy Gunn and combat-tested by pilots like Ed Larner. This innovation cycle, compressed to months rather than the years or decades typical of peacetime acquisition programs, demonstrated what military forces could achieve when institutional barriers to change were removed. General Kenny's decision to appoint Gunn as Special Projects Officer with authority to modify aircraft without waiting for formal approval from Washington accelerated development of the Strafer B-25 by at least a year, possibly more. That acceleration translated directly into tactical advantages that influenced strategic outcomes. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea validated Kenny's approach and encouraged similar innovation throughout the theater. Squadron commanders were empowered to experiment with new tactics. Maintenance personnel were encouraged to suggest modifications. Successful innovations were documented and spread rapidly through the force. This created an organizational culture where adaptation became routine rather than exceptional, giving 5th Air Force a sustained tactical advantage over Japanese forces that operated within more rigid doctrinal frameworks. Modern military organizations studying the Pacific Air War identify this adaptive culture as one of the key factors enabling American victory, despite early disadvantages in aircraft quality, pilot experience, and tactical positioning. By mid-1943, American forces had closed or reversed these gaps through innovation and industrial production. The B-25 Strafer, proven at Bismarck Sea and employed throughout subsequent campaigns, exemplified this transformation from early disadvantage to overwhelming superiority. Ed Larner didn't live to see the complete victory his contributions helped achieve. His death in April 1943 removed a talented combat leader at the height of his effectiveness. However, his influence persisted through the pilots he'd trained, the tactics he'd validated, and the example he'd set. The 90th Squadron continued employing skip bombing methods throughout the war, participating in additional major engagements, including the devastating attack on Rabaul Harbor in November 1943, where they destroyed or damaged dozens of Japanese vessels. The final accounting of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea places it among the most one-sided victories in naval aviation history. 8 Japanese transports sunk, 4 destroyers destroyed, approximately 3,000 enemy personnel killed, 7,000 reinforcements prevented from reaching their destination, all achieved at the cost of 13 Allied aircraft and personnel. The strategic impact forcing Japan to abandon sealift operations to New Guinea and accelerating the entire campaign's conclusion, justified every innovation and risk that led to this outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.